The drawing that no one understood. The classroom buzzed with restless energy, the kind that only children could create on a warm afternoon. Laughter, whispers, and the sound of pencils scratching filled the air. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting golden lines across scratched wooden desks. Miss Parker, their teacher, had given the students a simple assignment. "Draw something that means the most to you," she said cheerfully, her voice echoing above the noise. "Something close to your heart." For most of the children, the task was an excuse to show off. Some sketched superheroes with bulging muscles. Others drew shining castles with flying dragons. A few copied their friends' ideas, laughing as they leaned over each other's desks. But at the back of the room sat a quiet girl named Emma. She was small for her age, with light blonde hair tied in a ribbon her mother had carefully placed that morning. Her blue eyes were gentle but carried a sadness that most of her classmates never noticed or cared about. Today she clutched a worn pencil tightly, staring at the blank sheet in front of her. Her hand trembled slightly. She wasn't thinking about superheroes or castles or cars with giant wheels. What mattered most to her wasn't something her classmates would cheer for. It was her mother. Emma's mother had been sick for months. Once strong and full of energy, now she moved only with the help of a wheelchair. Emma had watched the illness steal her mother's strength day by day. But to Emma, her mother was still the most important person in the world. She began to draw. Her strokes were slow, careful, almost hesitant. She drew her mother sitting in the wheelchair, her face tired but smiling. She added the old blanket draped across her mother's legs and the flowers on the windowsill beside her. It was not perfect, the lines wobbled and the shading was uneven, but it was filled with love. By the time Emma looked up, the classroom was already noisy again. Some students had finished early and were wandering around to peek at others' drawings. Soon, a group of boys noticed Emma's paper. They stopped, stared, and then burst out laughing. "Is that supposed to be a person?" one of them snickered. "No, look, it's a stick figure in a chair," another jeered. "Who draws their mom in a wheelchair? That's so weird." The laughter spread quickly like fire catching dry grass. Emma's cheeks flushed red. She lowered her head, gripping her pencil so tightly it almost broke. Her chest tightened as if the whole room had turned against her. Miss Parker tried to quiet the noise, but the children were relentless. Whispers and giggles filled the air. Emma felt her eyes burning with tears she didn't want to show. And then, the classroom door opened. The laughter stopped almost instantly. A tall man in a sharp blue suit stepped inside. His presence seemed to silence even the most mischievous students. He was a visitor, someone important. His hair was neatly combed back, his tie perfectly knotted, and his polished shoes clicked against the floor. This was Jonathan Hale, a millionaire businessman, philanthropist, and guest of honor at the school that day. He had come to sponsor the school's art and education program. No one had expected him to enter the classroom at that exact moment. Miss Parker's face lit up nervously. "Oh, Mr. Hale, what a surprise. We were just working on an assignment." Jonathan smiled politely, his eyes scanning the room. "Please don't stop on my account. I'd love to see what the children are creating." Excited whispers filled the air. Students rushed to show him their colorful drawings of superheroes, castles, and dream houses. Jonathan looked at each with kind interest, complimenting them gently. But as he moved through the rows, his eyes caught the small figure sitting quietly at the back. Emma tried to hide her drawing under her arm, but Jonathan's sharp gaze noticed. He walked toward her desk. "What about you, young lady?" he asked warmly. "What have you drawn?" Emma hesitated. Her classmates snickered again, waiting for another chance to mock her. Slowly, with trembling hands, she pushed the paper forward. Jonathan picked it up carefully, studying it in silence. The room grew still. Every student leaned in, waiting for his reaction. What he said next shocked them all. "This," Jonathan said firmly, his voice carrying authority, "is the most powerful drawing I've seen today." The children gasped. Some exchanged confused looks. Miss Parker blinked in surprise. Jonathan held up the paper for the class to see. "Do you know what makes this special?" he continued. It's not just lines and shapes, it's honesty. This girl drew something real, something that matters. True art isn't about perfection, it's about truth. He turned back to Emma, his eyes softened, and for a moment it felt as if only the two of them existed in that room. You have courage, he told her gently. Never be ashamed of your truth. The classroom was silent. Even the boys who had mocked her earlier looked down, ashamed. Emma's heart pounded. No one had ever spoken about her drawings like that before. For the first time she felt seen, not just as a quiet girl in the back of the room, but as someone whose feelings mattered. Jonathan placed the paper back on her desk, leaning slightly so only she could hear. Don't stop drawing, Emma. You have something the world needs. He straightened, gave a nod to Miss Parker, and walked toward the door. But before leaving, he turned once more to address the entire class. Remember this, he said. It's easy to laugh at what you don't understand, but real strength is learning to respect it. And with that, he was gone. The door closed. Boo. The silence in the room remained heavy, almost sacred. Emma sat frozen, her cheeks still warm, her eyes wide. Her classmates avoided her gaze now, unsure of what to say. The same picture they had laughed at only minutes ago had been called powerful by a man who had the respect of the entire city. Emma didn't smile. She didn't need to. Deep inside, something had changed. A spark had been lit, something that would only grow brighter in the days to come. A seed of change. The following day, the atmosphere in the classroom felt different, though no one wanted to admit it out loud. The desks were in the same place, the sun still streamed through the tall windows, and Miss Parker's cheerful voice still filled the air, but something in the air had shifted. The memory of the millionaire in the blue suit praising Emma's drawing hung heavily over every student, like a whisper no one dared to repeat. Those who had laughed the loudest now avoided her eyes, while others whispered quietly, trying to make sense of what they had witnessed. Emma, however, walked into the classroom with her head still low, clutching her books tightly against her chest, unsure if yesterday's moment had been real or just a dream she had imagined to protect herself from shame. Miss Parker began her lesson, pretending that nothing unusual had happened, but she could not ignore the glances exchanged among the children. When she asked the class to open their notebooks, Emma noticed the boy who had mocked her the most, the one who had called her drawing a stick figure in a chair, sitting uncomfortably, biting his pencil. He glanced at her, then quickly looked away. For the first time, Emma felt that perhaps she wasn't the weakest person in the room anymore. Yet the unease did not bring her comfort. It left her more anxious than before. After school ended, as the children spilled out into the yard, Emma walked slowly down the steps, her bag heavy against her shoulder. She had almost reached the gate when she noticed a black car parked outside. Its sleek frame gleamed under the sun, far different from the old vehicles most parents drove. The door opened, and to her shock, Jonathan Hale stepped out. His presence was as commanding as it had been the day before, his blue suit pressed, his shoes polished, his posture tall and confident. For a moment, Emma froze, not sure if she should approach or run. Why would someone so important be waiting outside her small school? She lowered her gaze and tried to walk past quietly, but his voice called her name in a gentle yet firm tone. Emma, Jonathan said, his eyes softening as he looked down at her. Do you have a moment? Her heart raced. She turned slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, sir. He smiled warmly. No need to call me sir. Jonathan is fine. He knelt slightly so that his eyes were level with hers, a gesture that made her feel less small. I hope I didn't embarrass you yesterday. I only wanted your classmates to understand the value of your drawing. Emma shook her head quickly. No, you didn't embarrass me. Her voice cracked and she clutched her bag tighter. No one's ever said something like that about me before. Jonathan's expression softened even more, and for a brief moment, his mind traveled back to his own childhood. He remembered being the son of a struggling mechanic, mocked for his worn clothes and empty lunchbox. He remembered sitting at a desk much like Emma's, wishing someone, anyone, would see him for more than what he lacked. I know how it feels, he said quietly, to be laughed at when you show your heart. Emma blinked at him in surprise. How could a man like him, who owned tall buildings and businesses across the city, know what it was like to be mocked in a classroom? Yet the sincerity in his eyes told her that he was not pretending. Jonathan glanced at the school building and then back at Emma. "I'd like to meet your mother, if you're comfortable with that. I feel there's more to your story than a drawing." Emma hesitated. The thought of a millionaire stepping into her small, cluttered apartment where her sick mother rested felt overwhelming, almost unreal. But there was something in his voice that reassured her, something that told her he wasn't coming to judge but to understand. She nodded timidly. That evening, Jonathan arrived at their modest apartment. The building was old, its paint peeling, the hallways dimly lit. Emma's mother, Margaret, sat by the window in her wheelchair, wrapped in a worn blanket. Her face was pale, her hands frail, but her eyes lit up when she saw her daughter walk in. "Mom," Emma whispered, her voice trembling with nervous excitement. This is Mr. Hale." Margaret's eyes widened. "The Jonathan Hale? From the newspapers?" She tried to sit up straighter, embarrassed by the state of their home. Jonathan stepped forward gracefully and extended his hand. "It's an honor to meet you, ma'am. Please don't apologize for anything. You have a remarkable daughter." Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes as she clasped his hand. She's all I have," she whispered. The three of them sat together in the small living room. Jonathan listened as Margaret explained her illness and the struggles they faced. Medical bills, limited income, the constant worry of tomorrow. Emma sat quietly beside her, fiddling with her ribbon, afraid that the truth of their hardship would scare Jonathan away. But instead, his expression only grew more serious, more determined. "Emma," Jonathan said finally, turning to her, "your drawing yesterday told me more about you than words ever could. You have a gift, not just for art, but for seeing the world with honesty. That's something people often lose as they grow older." He paused, his voice steady. "I want to help you, not by handing you everything, but by giving you opportunities to grow." Emma's breath caught in her throat. "Help? Me?" Jonathan nodded. "Yes, I sponsor programs for young talent. But with you, it's not about talent alone. It's about courage. I want to see what happens when that courage is nurtured." Margaret wiped her eyes with the edge of her blanket. "Mr. Hale, we can't repay you. We have nothing." Jonathan raised a hand gently. "I'm not asking for repayment. Consider it an investment not in money, but in the future, Emma's future." The room fell silent, but it was a silence filled with possibility. For the first time in years, Margaret felt hope stir inside her, fragile but alive. Emma, meanwhile, sat frozen, torn between disbelief and gratitude. She could not understand why someone so powerful had chosen to see her when everyone else had looked away. As Jonathan prepared to leave, he turned to Emma with a smile. "Keep drawing, bring your heart to paper. I'll be back soon to see what you've created." When the door closed behind him, the apartment felt strangely brighter, as if his presence had left a trace of light behind. Margaret pulled Emma close, her frail arms wrapping around her daughter. "Do you see, my love?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "One moment of courage can change everything." Emma buried her face into her mother's shoulder, her tears soaking into the blanket. For the first time in her young life, she dared to believe those words. The first step into the light. The weeks following Jonathan Hale's visit were unlike anything Emma had ever experienced. Life inside her small apartment was still hard. Her mother's illness did not disappear, the bills still arrived in stacks, and the nights were often heavy with worry. But there was something new that carried them forward. It was the sense that someone powerful and kind had stepped into their world, and with him had come the possibility of change. Emma felt it every morning when she tied the ribbon in her hair before school. She felt it in her footsteps as she walked past classmates who no longer dared to laugh in her face. She felt it especially when she looked at her drawings, each one seeming to carry a little more life, a little more courage than before. She was no longer drawing only for herself. She was drawing because someone believed she had something worth showing. One Friday afternoon, as she was gathering her books, Miss Parker approached her desk with a smile that seemed both nervous and excited. "Emma," she said softly, "Mr. Hale has invited me, and you, to attend the city's annual youth art exhibition tomorrow. He called the school this morning to make the arrangements." Emma's eyes widened, her hands freezing in place as her heart pounded in her chest. The youth art exhibition was something she had only heard about in whispers, an event where hundreds of young artists displayed their work in the city's grand hall, their paintings and sketches viewed by critics, collectors, and dignitaries. For a child like Emma, who came from a background of poverty and invisibility, the idea of stepping into that world felt almost impossible. The next morning, Emma dressed in her best outfit, a simple blue dress that her mother had ironed carefully the night before. Margaret insisted on brushing her daughter's hair despite the weakness in her hands, smiling faintly as she tied the ribbon. "You look beautiful, my love," she whispered. "Your art will speak louder than you think." When Jonathan's car arrived outside their building, Emma felt as though she were walking into a dream. The car door opened, and he greeted her with a smile that put her at ease. "Ready?" he asked warmly, as though this were not a favor, but a partnership. The grand hall of the exhibition was nothing like the small classrooms Emma knew. Tall marble pillars lined the entrance, crystal chandeliers sparkled above, and the air hummed with conversation and music. Children and teenagers walked proudly beside their easels, explaining their work to visitors. The paintings were extraordinary, bright landscapes, detailed portraits, abstract visions bursting with color. Emma's steps slowed, and for a moment she wished she could disappear. Her drawings seemed small compared to these works of brilliance. But Jonathan noticed her hesitation and leaned down to speak quietly. "Remember what I told you," he said. "It's not about perfection. It's about truth. Show them your truth." Her drawing of her mother in the wheelchair had been framed and placed at the edge of a long gallery wall. Emma stood beside it nervously, her fingers twisting together. At first, people walked past without stopping, their eyes drawn to the louder, more colorful pieces nearby. Each minute that passed felt like an eternity, and Emma's chest grew heavy with doubt. Perhaps her classmates had been right after all. Perhaps her drawing was nothing more than a child's scribble, undeserving of this stage. Then something unexpected happened. A woman in her 40s wearing a red scarf stopped in front of the drawing. She tilted her head, studying it closely. Her lips trembled as if she were holding back tears. "This," she whispered, "this is real." She beckoned her husband, who joined her and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Soon others gathered, murmuring softly, drawn not by brilliance of color, but by the quiet honesty of a child's love captured in shaky lines. Jonathan, standing a few steps away, watched with satisfaction. He had seen this before, how authenticity, once noticed, could draw hearts more strongly than any display of skill. He stepped closer and introduced Emma gently to the small crowd. "This is the young artist," he said, his voice carrying a note of pride. Emma's face burned red, but the words filled her with warmth. The woman with the red scarf bent down to meet her eyes. "Thank you for showing this," she said. "My mother was in a wheelchair too, and your drawing, it reminded me of her strength." The words broke something open inside Emma. For the first time, she realized that her private pain could touch someone else, that her art could carry meaning beyond her own little world. She looked up at Jonathan, who gave her a reassuring nod, and in that moment she stood a little taller. The exhibition continued, and by the end of the evening, Emma's drawing had been written about in the local newspaper. A journalist described it as a simple but profoundly moving piece of art that silenced laughter and reminded us of the power of love. Back at school, whispers spread quickly. The same children who had mocked her now looked at her with a strange mix of curiosity and unease. Some wanted to talk to her, others kept their distance, but none dared to laugh again. For Emma, however, the biggest change was not in how her classmates treated her, but in how she saw herself. She began to draw more often, filling pages with sketches of her mother, of their home, of the world she wished to see. Each line carried her deeper into herself, helping her understand that art was not only an escape, but a bridge between her heart and the hearts of others. Yet even as light began to break into her life, shadows remained. Margaret's health continued to decline, and the weight of uncertainty still pressed upon their small household. Sometimes Emma would sit at her desk at night, her mother asleep in the next room, and wonder if hope was enough to fight the realities that loomed over them. But then she would remember Jonathan's words, the woman with the red scarf, and the crowd that had gathered in front of her drawing. Those memories kept her pencil moving, line by line, as though she were sketching her way toward a future she could not yet see. Jonathan, meanwhile, was not done. In private conversations with school officials, he began making arrangements, scholarships, mentorships, opportunities designed to nurture Emma's gift. He saw in her not just a child with potential, but a mirror of his own struggles, and he was determined to ensure that the spark he had recognized would not be extinguished. And so, what began as a single drawing on a crumpled piece of paper in the back of a classroom was now slowly becoming something larger. A story that was no longer just Emma's, but one that touched everyone who encountered it. It was a story that would continue to grow, challenging laughter with truth and despair with hope. Whispers of doubt and the weight of change. The excitement of the art exhibition carried into the following weeks. But as with all stories that spread quickly, not everyone viewed Emma's sudden attention with kindness. In the beginning, her classmates tiptoed around her, unsure of what to say after the millionaire's praise had turned their laughter into silence. Some watched her with cautious curiosity, whispering behind her back but no longer daring to openly mock her. Others tried to befriend her, sensing that being close to Emma now carried a certain importance. Yet beneath the surface of their shifting behavior was something more dangerous than laughter: jealousy. Children who had once enjoyed being at the center of attention now found themselves overshadowed by the quiet girl at the back of the classroom, and their resentment simmered in whispers and glares. At home, Emma noticed the change in ways she had not expected strangers be eager to stop her and her mother in the street, recognizing her from the newspaper article that had described her drawing as the piece that moved a city. Some offered kind words of encouragement, while others, with skeptical eyes, muttered that Jonathan Hale had only praised her to polish his own reputation. Emma was too young to understand the complexities of public opinion, but she felt the weight of those doubts pressing down on her small shoulders. It was as though the world had suddenly grown larger and harsher, demanding things from her that she had never been prepared to give. Margaret, watching her daughter's growing unease, often pulled Emma close and whispered gently, "Do not let their words steal your heart. People will always talk, but your truth belongs only to you." Still, Margaret's own health was slipping further away. Some days she barely had the strength to rise from bed, and Emma would sit quietly beside her, sketching her mother's fragile face while praying that the lines of her drawing could somehow hold her together. The fear of losing her mother haunted her more than any jealousy or whispers could. Jonathan, sensing the strain that public attention was placing on Emma, invited her once more to his office in the city. The towering glass building was a world away from her small apartment, and Emma's eyes widened as she stepped into the grand lobby where businessmen and women hurried about in pressed suits. She clutched her sketchbook tightly, her knuckles white, afraid that she did not belong in a place so polished and perfect. But when Jonathan came down to greet her, his smile was warm, his voice calm, and in his presence the building felt less intimidating. He led her to a quiet meeting room where the walls were lined with art pieces from around the world, abstract paintings, landscapes, portraits in oil and charcoal. Emma's eyes lingered on them, awe and self-doubt battling within her. Jonathan noticed her hesitation and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Do not compare yourself to these works," he said. "Art is not a race, it is a mirror, and every mirror reflects something different." Emma nodded, though the insecurity in her chest still burned. She sat across from him as he poured her a glass of water, his movements deliberate and kind. Then he leaned forward, his eyes steady on hers. "Emma, I want to prepare you for something important. Whenever someone steps into the light, shadows will always try to follow. People will question you not because of what you have done wrong, but because they cannot understand how truth can come from someone they overlooked. They may say you are too young or too simple, or that you were lifted only because of me. You must not let them write your story for you. You must keep writing it yourself." The words sank into her heart, heavy yet strengthening. For the first time, she realized that Jonathan was not just praising her drawings. He was preparing her for a journey she had not chosen but now had to walk. She clutched her sketchbook tighter as though it were her shield and whispered, "I'll try." Jonathan smiled faintly. "Do more than try. Believe." In the days that followed, the whispers did grow louder. At school, a group of children cornered Emma during recess, their faces sharp with jealousy. "He only praised you because he felt sorry for you," one sneered. "It's not like you're really good at drawing." Another added, "Anyone could draw a stick figure in a chair. It's just because you're poor and your mom's sick that he pretends it's special." The words cut deeper than laughter ever had. Emma's throat tightened, her eyes stung with tears, but she refused to cry in front of them. She turned and walked away, her legs shaking beneath her, her chest aching with shame. That night she sat in her room staring at her blank page, her pencil unmoving. Doubt gnawed at her spirit, whispering that maybe they were right. Maybe her art was not good enough. Maybe Jonathan had only spoken out of pity. For the first time since the exhibition, she wanted to give up. But then she heard her mother's faint voice from the other room. "Emma, are you drawing tonight?" Emma swallowed hard, tears spilling onto the page. She could not lie. "No, Mama, not tonight." There was silence, then the sound of her mother coughing, followed by a soft reply. "Don't let them take it from you, my love. Your pencil is your voice. If you stop drawing, you let them win." Emma's hand trembled as she picked up the pencil again. The lines were shaky at first, uncertain, but as the night went on, her strokes grew stronger. She drew not for Jonathan, not for her classmates, not for the strangers in the street, but for her mother, for herself, for the love that burned quietly but fiercely in her heart. When Jonathan visited again the following week, he found Emma sitting at her kitchen table, surrounded by pages filled with sketches. Each drawing told a story. Her mother by the window, the apartment hallway, even her own classmates drawn with raw honesty. He studied them carefully, his eyes shining with pride. "This," he said firmly, "is what I was hoping to see. You are not copying anyone. You are speaking in your own voice." Emma looked up at him, her cheeks flushed. "But people say I'm only noticed because of you." Jonathan's expression grew serious. He leaned closer and spoke with a voice that carried both steel and compassion. "Do you know what they are really saying, Emma? They are saying they are afraid. Afraid that someone they dismissed as small could hold power. Afraid that their laughter has no strength against your truth. Let them talk. You must keep drawing." His words settled in her like roots sinking into soil. The doubts did not vanish, but they no longer held the same power. For the first time, she understood that her art was not about recognition. It was about courage, about refusing to be silenced. And so, even as shadows gathered around her, Emma began to step more firmly into the light. The turning point of fire and light. The announcement came on a Monday morning when the entire class was gathered in the assembly hall. The principal, a tall woman with glasses perched on her nose, stood at the podium with a sheet of paper in her hands. Her voice echoed across the hall as she declared that the school had been invited to send one representative to the National Children's Art Competition, an event that would gather young artists from across the country. The words stirred excitement among the students, and soon the room buzzed with eager chatter. Some began boasting about how their colorful superheroes or grand landscapes would surely win. Others elbowed their friends, whispering about how much glory such an opportunity would bring. Emma sat quietly in her seat, her hands folded in her lap, her heart pounding. She did not think of herself as someone who could ever stand on such a stage. Yet when the principal's eyes scanned the room and landed on her, Emma felt the air in her lungs freeze. It was Jonathan Hale who had recommended her to the school board. They had asked for his opinion, given his role as the benefactor of the new art program, and without hesitation he had spoken her name. His belief in her seemed unshakable, even as doubts gnawed at her own mind. When the announcement was made official and Emma's name was spoken into the microphone, the hall fell into a stunned silence. A few clapped politely, some exchanged bewildered looks, and a handful of jealous whispers hissed from the back rows, but Emma heard none of it. She sat frozen in her chair, her cheeks burning, her breath shallow. All she could think was, they've made a mistake. I don't belong there. That afternoon, as she walked home with her books pressed tightly against her chest, her classmates' voices followed her like sharp arrows. She'll embarrass us in front of the whole country. It's only because the millionaire likes her. Wait until real artists see her stick figures. The words stung worse than ever, and by the time she reached her apartment, she was trembling. Margaret noticed immediately, her mother's intuition sharper than any blade. She called her daughter to her side, brushing her fingers gently through Emma's hair. They are loud because they are afraid, she whispered. Afraid that you might prove them wrong. My love, you have already won by being chosen. The rest is only a matter of drawing your truth. Jonathan arrived later that evening as promised, to help Emma prepare. He found her sitting at the table with a blank sheet in front of her, the pencil untouched. Her eyes were red from holding back tears. Jonathan sat across from her without a word, simply watching until she finally whispered, "What if they're right? What if I don't belong there? What if my drawing looks foolish compared to the others?" He leaned forward, his voice calm but carrying the weight of someone who had fought his own battles. "Emma, every great person in history has been told they don't belong. When I was your age, I wore secondhand clothes and children laughed at me because my shoes had holes. Teachers doubted me. Neighbors pitied me, but I decided that their voices would not define me. The question is not whether you belong. The question is whether you will have the courage to show up anyway." Her eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "But I'm scared." Jonathan placed his hand over hers, firm but gentle. "Then draw your fear. Draw your truth. Fear is not weakness. It is the proof that you are standing at the edge of something important. The only thing that matters is that your drawing comes from the deepest place in your heart." With those words echoing inside her, Emma began to sketch again in the nights leading up to the competition. Her pencil moved slowly at first, but then with greater certainty. She filled pages with her mother's face, her smile shining despite illness, her hands frail yet full of warmth. She drew herself standing beside her mother, holding her hand, their bond unbroken even in the shadow of sickness. And finally, she drew a scene that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her. Her mother in the wheelchair, surrounded by a glow of light, smiling as though the pain had vanished, as though strength had returned. It was not a picture of what was, but of what Emma believed could be, the triumph of love over suffering. The day of the competition arrived, and the city's grand auditorium was alive with color and noise. Hundreds of young artists from across the nation gathered, their easels standing tall, their palettes overflowing with paint. The walls were lined with canvases that dazzled the eye, majestic landscapes, portraits so lifelike they seemed to breathe, abstract creations that seemed to dance under the lights. Emma walked among them with her sketchbook in her trembling hands, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the announcer's instructions. Compared to the boldness of the others, her work felt small, fragile, almost invisible. Jonathan accompanied her. Dressed once more in his sharp blue suit, he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder and spoke quietly so only she could hear. "Remember, Emma, you are not here to outshine them. You are here to show your truth. That is enough." When her turn came, Emma's hands shook as she placed her drawing on the easel for the judges. The lights above seemed too bright, the silence in the hall too heavy. She wanted to run, to disappear, but then her eyes caught sight of her mother in the front row, sitting in her wheelchair, her face pale but her eyes shining with pride. The sight filled Emma with a sudden strength she had never felt before. She stood straighter, lifted her chin, and allowed her drawing to speak for her. The judges approached, their eyes scanning the paper. At first they were silent, their faces unreadable. Then one leaned closer, her expression softening. Another adjusted his glasses, nodding slowly. Finally, the head judge turned to Emma and asked, "Why did you choose this subject?" Emma swallowed hard, her voice trembling but clear enough to carry. "Because my mother is the most important person in my life. She is sick, but she still smiles every day. I wanted to draw not just her wheelchair, but her strength. This is how I see her, not broken but shining." A hush fell over the room. The judges exchanged glances, and then one of them, with tears in her eyes, whispered, "Extraordinary." The audience erupted into applause, not the polite kind reserved for children, but a wave of clapping that rolled through the hall, growing louder and louder until it echoed in Emma's chest. She stood frozen, her heart racing, as she realized that for once, the world was not laughing, it was listening. When the winners were announced, Emma's name was called first. She had won the national prize. The applause that followed seemed to shake the very walls of the auditorium. John. Ethan's smile was wide with pride. Margaret's tears flowed freely, and Emma felt as though she were standing in the middle of a dream made real. She walked to the stage to receive her medal, her hands trembling, but her spirit soaring higher than it had ever dared before. That night, as they returned home, Emma sat quietly in the back of Jonathan's car, the medal heavy around her neck. She held her mother's hand tightly, afraid to let go, afraid the moment would vanish. Margaret leaned close and whispered, "Do you see now, my love? The truth in your heart is stronger than their laughter. Never forget this day." Emma nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. For the first time, she truly believed her mother's words. She had faced her fear. She had stood in the light, and she had triumphed, not by being perfect, but by being real. And though she could not yet see it, this victory was only the beginning of a journey that would change not only her life, but the lives of countless others who would one day hear her story. The weight of a voice. The days after Emma's national victory unfolded like scenes from someone else's life. Newspapers carried her story on their front pages, describing her as the little girl whose honesty silenced a hall of critics. Photographers came to her school, snapping pictures of her with her medal around her neck, her ribbon in her hair, and her sketchbook clutched close to her chest. Television crews arrived as well, asking questions in excited voices, marveling that a child so small had touched an entire nation with a drawing so simple. Emma often stood frozen in front of the cameras, her cheeks burning, her voice trembling, but each time she spoke, the words came straight from her heart. "I only wanted to draw my mother," she would say. "She is my hero." Those words, repeated on screens across the country, struck deeper than any rehearsed speech could have. Back at school, the environment shifted yet again. Many of her classmates, who had once mocked her drawings, now hovered around were in admiration, eager to sit near her or ask her questions. Some even tried to copy her style, scribbling drawings of their families in hopes of capturing the same kind of attention. But Emma noticed that their eyes often carried confusion or envy, as though they did not understand how a child like her could stand at the center of so much praise. It made her uncomfortable, and often she preferred to sit quietly by herself, sketching in the corner, rather than bask in the shallow friendship of those who had once laughed at her pain. Jonathan, however, understood that Emma's story was only just beginning. He arranged for her artwork to be included in a charity exhibition where paintings and sketches would be sold to raise funds for children's hospitals. Emma's piece, a portrait of her mother bathed in gentle light, was purchased by a philanthropist for a sum that left her speechless. Jonathan made sure every dollar went directly toward her mother's medical care. When Margaret heard the news, tears rolled silently down her cheeks. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to hope that perhaps her illness could be managed, that she might have more time with her daughter. Yet even as blessings poured into their lives, the weight of expectation grew heavier on Emma's shoulders. Every article written about her, every speech given by Jonathan that mentioned her name, seemed to place her higher on a pedestal she had never asked to stand upon. At night, lying awake in her small bed, she sometimes whispered to herself, "What if I fail? What if the next drawing is not enough?" The fear of disappointing Jonathan, her mother, and now the strangers who had begun to look to her as a symbol, pressed down on her like a stone. Jonathan, ever perceptive, noticed her unease. One evening, after driving Emma and Margaret home from a hospital appointment, he lingered at the door and said softly, "Emma, may I speak with you for a moment?" She nodded, stepping out into the hallway with him, the weight of a voice. The days after Emma's national victory unfolded like scenes from someone else's life. Newspapers carried her story on their front pages, describing her as the little girl whose honesty silenced a hall of critics. Photographers came to her school snapping pictures of her with her medal around her neck, her ribbon in her hair, and her sketchbook clutched close to her chest. Television crews arrived as well, asking questions in excited voices, marveling that a child so small had touched an entire nation with a drawing so simple. Emma often stood frozen in front of the cameras, her cheeks burning, her voice trembling, but each time she spoke, the words came straight from her heart. "I only wanted to draw my mother," she would say. "She is my hero." Those words, repeated on screens across the country, struck deeper than any rehearsed speech could have. Back at school, the environment shifted yet again. Many of her classmates who had once mocked her drawings now hovered around her in admiration, eager to sit near her or ask her questions. Some even tried to copy her style, scribbling drawings of their families in hopes of capturing the same kind of attention. But Emma noticed that their eyes often carried confusion or envy, as though they did not understand how a child like her could stand at the center of so much praise. It made her uncomfortable, and often she preferred to sit quietly by herself, sketching in the corner, rather than bask in the shallow friendship of those who had once laughed at her pain. Jonathan, however, understood that Emma's story was only just beginning. He arranged for her artwork to be included in a charity exhibition where paintings and sketches would be sold to raise funds for children's hospitals. Emma's piece, a portrait of her mother bathed in gentle light, was purchased by a philanthropist for a sum that left her speechless. Jonathan made sure every dollar went directly toward her mother's medical care. When Margaret heard the news, tears rolled silently down her cheeks. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to hope that perhaps her illness could be managed, that she might have more time with her daughter. Yet even as blessings poured into their lives, the weight of expectation grew heavier on Emma's shoulders. Every article written about her, every speech given by Jonathan that mentioned her name, seemed to place her higher on a pedestal she had never asked to stand upon. At night, lying awake in her small bed, she sometimes whispered to herself, "What if I fail? What if the next drawing is not enough?" The fear of disappointing Jonathan, her mother, and now the strangers who had begun to look to her as a symbol, pressed down on her like a stone. Jonathan, ever perceptive, noticed her unease. One evening, after driving Emma and Margaret home from a hospital appointment, he lingered at the door and said softly, "Emma, may I speak with you for a moment?" She nodded, stepping out into the hallway with him. His voice was calm, measured, but carried an edge of urgency. "I can see the weight you are carrying. You must understand, my dear, that you do not need to be perfect for anyone, not for me, not for the newspapers, not even for your classmates. The world will always demand more, but what matters is not more, it is truth. If your drawing tomorrow is smaller than today, if it is simpler, it does not erase your courage. Do you understand?" Emma's eyes filled with tears and she nodded slowly. "But everyone looks at me now. I'm scared of letting them down." Jonathan crouched so his gaze met hers. "Listen to me. You are not responsible for carrying the world. You are responsible for carrying your heart. If you keep drawing what is real, you will never let anyone down. Even if they don't understand, even if they criticize, you will have honored the truth, and that is all that matters." Those words planted themselves deep within her, though it would take time for her to fully believe them. In the weeks that followed, she attended more events, sometimes speaking shyly to audiences about her mother, sometimes simply watching from the side as Jonathan explained the importance of supporting children like her. The foundation he had quietly begun in her name grew quickly, drawing donations from across the country. Its mission was simple but powerful: to support children with ill or disabled parents, giving them access to art programs, therapy, and financial aid. Emma had become the face of this movement, her story proving that from pain could rise beauty and strength. But with every new honor came new trials. There were still voices of doubt, critics who claimed Jonathan was only using Emma for publicity, skeptics who questioned whether a child's simple sketches deserved such attention. Sometimes journalists asked questions that cut too deeply, like knives wrapped in polite words. Don't you think you were chosen only because of your background? Or do you really believe your art belongs beside professionals? Each time, Emma's throat tightened and she wanted to hide. But then she would think of her mother sitting proudly in her wheelchair, or of Jonathan who stood like a shield beside her, and she would gather enough courage to answer, "I draw because it is the only way I know how to tell the truth. That is enough for me." Meanwhile, Margaret's illness grew worse despite the treatments. There were nights when Emma woke to the sound of her mother's coughing, her frail body trembling, and fear gripped her heart so tightly she could barely breathe. She would sit beside her bed, sketching quietly in the dim light, trying to capture every detail of her mother's face as if the drawings could hold her together. Those moments reminded Emma why she drew in the first place, not for medals or applause, but to hold on to love, to fight against loss with the only weapon she had. One afternoon, Jonathan surprised Emma by bringing her to a large auditorium where hundreds of children were gathered for a workshop. The stage was set with easels and supplies, and a banner overhead read, "Your voice matters." Jonathan leaned down and whispered, "Today, you will not only draw, you will speak." Emma's stomach tightened with fear, but Jonathan's steady hand on her shoulder gave her courage. When she stepped onto the stage, the crowd of children fell silent, waiting for her. Her voice was small at first, but it grew stronger as she spoke from her heart. "I used to think my drawings were nothing. My classmates laughed at me. I was ashamed. But then I realized that art is not about making something perfect. It's about showing your heart. And if someone laughs, it's only because they don't understand yet. Don't stop. Don't hide. Draw, sing, write. Whatever is in you, let it out. Because your truth matters." The hall erupted in applause, and Emma felt something shift inside her. For the first time, she saw that her story was not just about her and her mother. It was about every child who had ever been laughed at, doubted, or silenced. She was no longer just a girl with a pencil. She was a voice for countless others who had none. That night, as she returned home, exhausted but filled with a strange new strength, she sat beside her mother and whispered, "Mama, I think Jonathan was right. Maybe my drawings really can help others." Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand, her weak voice filled with love. "My love they already have. And one day when I am no longer here, your drawings will still carry my smile into the world." Emma's throat tightened with tears, but she nodded, her heart burning with determination. She knew then that her journey was far from over, that the weight she carried was heavy, but it was not a burden. It was a gift. The legacy of light. Years passed and time moved with a swiftness that left Emma sometimes breathless when she paused to think about how far she had come. The shy, trembling child who once sat in the back of a classroom mocked for drawing her mother in a wheelchair was no longer the girl who looked down at her shoes to avoid the sting of laughter. She had grown into a young woman, her hair now longer but still tied back with the same ribbon her mother once placed in her hair, a ribbon she refused to part with even when the world offered her finer things. Her eyes, once wide with fear, now shone with confidence born of trials endured and victories won. Emma had not become a celebrity in the shallow sense, but something deeper, an artist and a voice whose story touched hearts far beyond the walls of her old school. Her journey had not been smooth. The years following her first national victory brought both triumphs and losses. She continued to win competitions, not always the first prize, but often the prize that mattered most, the recognition of authenticity. Her drawings evolved as she grew older, moving from simple sketches of her mother to profound works that explored love, resilience, and the invisible strength hidden in ordinary lives. Each stroke of her pencil carried the echo of her past, and each canvas became a bridge between her heart and the world. Yet along this path, she also faced heartbreak. Her mother's health, despite every treatment funded by Jonathan's support, continued to decline. Emma was at her bedside when Margaret finally closed her eyes for the last time, whispering with her final breath, "Never stop drawing, my Lo. Carry me with you in your art." The loss tore Emma's heart apart, but in the midst of grief, she understood what her mother had meant all along. Her drawings were not just for herself. They were her way of keeping love alive, of ensuring that what mattered most would never be forgotten. Jonathan stood by her side through it all. Though his own years were advancing, his energy and sharp mind remained unshaken. He had been many things in his life, a businessman, a philanthropist, a public figure, but when he looked at Emma, he often confessed that helping her rise was the greatest work he had ever done. Their bond had grown beyond mentor and student. He became the father figure she had lost too early in life, and she became the living proof of everything he had once believed but struggled to express, that courage, when nurtured, could change not only one life but countless others. On evenings when they met in his office, surrounded by towering buildings and glittering city lights, Jonathan would smile and say, "Emma, do you see? This is what happens when one child refuses to stay silent." And Emma would smile back, grateful for the man in the blue suit who had first seen her truth when everyone else had mocked it. As Emma entered her 20s, her story began to ripple far beyond her city. Invitations arrived from schools, universities, and international conferences asking her to speak about the power of honesty in art. She stood on stages before thousands, her once trembling voice now steady, and told the story of a little girl who drew her sick mother while her classmates laughed. Each time she spoke, the rooms grew silent and people leaned forward, captivated not by perfection or glamour, but by the raw humanity in her words. She never painted herself as a hero. She always pointed back to her mother's strength and Jonathan's faith in her. "I am not here because I watkins as the best," she often said. "I am here because I dared to draw what was true." Her foundation, which Jonathan had started in her name, flourished into a national movement. Children from struggling families, once voiceless, now had platforms to express themselves through art, music, writing, and performance. Emma traveled to meet them, sitting cross-legged on classroom floors, sketching beside them, listening to their stories. She saw herself in their eyes, the fear, the doubt, the longing to be heard, and she reminded each one, "Your truth matters. Don't ever let laughter silence you." These visits were often not covered by newspapers, and no medals were handed out, but to Emma, they were the most important moments of her work. One particularly poignant evening came when Jonathan, now gray-haired and slower in his step, invited Emma to a private dinner. They sat across from each other in a quiet restaurant, the hum of conversation around them fading into the background. He looked at her with eyes heavy, not with sadness, but with reflection. "Emma," he said slowly, his voice still carrying the same strength as when she first met him, "I have built many things in my life, companies, buildings, even programs, but none of it means as much to me as what I see in you. You are my proof that one moment of kindness can ripple farther than any empire." His words sank deep into her heart, and she realized then how much his belief had carried her, how the strength of a single voice had given her the courage to find her own. When Jonathan passed away a few years later, the world mourned the loss of a great philanthropist. But Emma wept not for the businessman or the public figure. She wept for the man who had bent down in a noisy classroom to tell a trembling girl that her drawing was powerful, who had walked into her small apartment and spoken of courage when she had only known fear, who had believed in her when laughter had nearly crushed her spirit. At his memorial, she stood before a vast audience and said with tears in her eyes, "The world knew him as a millionaire. I knew him as the man who taught me that truth is stronger than ridicule and that kindness is stronger than power. His legacy lives not in his wealth, but in the voices he chose to lift." Years later, as Emma herself grew older, she often visited schools, sitting quietly in the back as children drew pictures for simple assignments. She would watch them the way Jonathan once watched her, looking not for perfection, but for truth. When she found a child whose drawing carried something real, a moment of love, a glimpse of struggle, an unpolished honesty, she would lean down and whisper words that echoed from her past. "Don't stop drawing. Your truth is powerful." And so the circle continued. A story passed from one life to another. The millionaire in the blue suit was gone, but his voice lived on through Emma. Her mother was gone, but her smile shone in every canvas Emma touched. And Emma herself became the proof that one act of kindness, one moment of courage could ripple across generations, turning laughter into silence, doubt into belief, and weakness into light. As she stood one evening before a vast audience in a hall filled with young dreamers, Emma ended her speech with words that had become her life's creed. One voice of kindness can silence 1,000 voices of cruelty. One drawing can change a life, and one life lived with courage can change the world. The applause that followed rose like thunder, but in her heart, Emma heard only two voices, her mother's gentle whisper and Jonathan's steady encouragement, guiding her still.